Hello, welcome once again to Off the Shelf Books on Tour. Can you tell it's been a while since I've said that? I have a most interesting book to speak with you about today, The Weight of Ink. And my guest is Rachel Kadish. And I can't tell you the time and energy this young woman put into this book. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
I speed read. I couldn't. I was so afraid I was going to miss a morsel, something that pertained, 3 love stories, interwoven like a fine tapestry. How long did it take you to put it together?
Oh my goodness, I was afraid you were going to ask me that. A really long time, much longer than my other books. Start to finish, I worked on this for close to 13 years. During that time, I wrote short stories and essays, and I teach, and I had young kids at the time. So, but I kept coming back to this between the research and the writing and just figuring out the plot and all of that.
But it comes through. It comes through that you invested a better part of your life in it. And I specifically like the paper that the pages are printed on. Did you have anything to say about that, or was that an editor's
The
idea?
actual physical book?
Yes.
No, that was all Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and I thought they did such a wonderful job.
Yes.
Just, you spend all these years working on a book, and it's your baby, and then someone turns it into a beautiful object. And
What was it like when you opened the box and saw it there? It was
that-
like birth of the fourth
that
child?
never gets old.
No.
That is a wonderful feeling.
Yeah, but whoever did it did you justice. They gave me a Kindle to read. I read 7 books in one night, and I didn't retain anything. Mm-hmm. So I have to turn the pages of the book. I have to be there. And the weight of these pages, the tactile response, it just befits the time span, and the effort that you put into matching it all together.
Thank you. Well, as you can probably guess, I'm a big fan of old forms of writing. I actually learned how to write with a quill pen and ink when I was writing this book, just because I needed to know what it would feel like, what that sounds like, the way my characters would write in the 17th century.
Oh, I remember that from elementary school. We had inkwells when we first started the first grade, and the boys would put your pigtail in it behind you, and you'd go home with this big blue stain. It wasn't gall ink. All those little teeny nuances like gall ink. I was telling somebody about that yesterday, that it ate through the paper and you couldn't read it, but when you held it up, there was a silhouette of where it had eaten through. I mean, all those little nuances made it so very interesting. Thank you. And you're a wordsmith. You're so careful to use the words of the period, and I'm terribly upset that they've taken cursive writing out of our schools. But 3 states have now reinstituted it.
Oh, really? They're bringing back the old script?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's one of the reasons why I am a researcher. And if you really need to prove something or do something, and you go back 50 years, 100 years, Old English is bad enough with the these and the thous and the does. If you can't read cursive writing, no computer in the world's going to save you.
Yeah. Well, for all that I spend a lot of time thinking about different forms of writing, because it's kind of fascinating to me, I think one of the most important things that I was thinking about when I was writing the book, and it ended up being reflected in the title, is the weight of ink, the importance of just the words we choose in the writing, and how that can be life or death. What we say and how we say it, and how free we feel to say what we think is true.
And particularly the personalities in the book. I mean, there are some people who think they're having a bad day. They don't know what it's like.
Researching the 17th century definitely gave me a perspective, definitely made me feel less sorry for myself for all my little ups and downs and travails. Just thinking about what it took for somebody to get an education when that wasn't freely given to them, to not know from day to day when the plague was going to hit. Their whole relationship to health, to mortality, to even daylight was so different from ours. To sending a letter and you don't know if it's going to get there or the ship is going to sink.
Mm-hmm. And the sad thing is there are today as much as women have gone as far as they have, I'm here and you're here, there are still women who can't be educated.
You know, the origin of the book for me, the way I always start writing when something is kind of bugging me and I don't know exactly what I think of it. There's this Henry James quote I love, which is, how do I know what I think until I see what I say? And when something's bugging me, I have to start writing, and then I think, oh yeah, that's what I think. And in this case, one of the things that was bugging me was a Virginia Woolf quote where she said, she asks the question, what if William Shakespeare had an equally talented sister? What would have been the fate of that woman, a woman with that kind of mind, but with the restrictions of that time? And then Woolf answers her own question, and the answer is really depressing. It's, she died young. Alas, she never wrote a word. And you can't argue that that's the most likely fate for a woman in that era. A very talented woman, but I couldn't help kind of shadowboxing, you know, what would it take for a woman not to die without writing a word in that era, or writing a symphony or painting a painting or whatever she had in her. And I thought, well, she would have to be a genius at breaking the rules. So that made me want to write a historical novel to go back in time and look at this question of what does it take for a woman not to be defeated when everything is telling her to sit down and mind her manners.
And somewhere in our lifetime and in reality, there's an Esther.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who
Absolutely.
wanted, who tried, who wrote. I wish I could find that trove of papers.
Yes. Well, I think
And
that
I could read them because I can read cursive.
there you go. There you go. But I think that there must be so many things that were written or done or works of art made anonymously or under false names that were by women throughout history.
Oh,
it
I'm
just
sure
has
of
to
it.
be the case.
Especially
We're discovering
paintings.
them. Yes, we keep discovering them. So of course we haven't discovered all that's out there. Of course there's more.
No, and the Me Too movement only elaborates it, put it under a microscope, takes it one step back further than what hits the news every day. But, I don't know if you've felt it, but I helped. The world doesn't like a strong woman. The world doesn't like a woman who speaks her mind, who won't shut up when she's told to shut up, and usually yells louder. And to this day, you pay the price.
I think one of the things that's been amazing to me as I've traveled around talking to people about this book is the resonance that this story from the 17th century of a woman who really fought in order to have a voice, how resonant that is today. How many people have come and told me that they relate to it in some way.
But the sad thing is, if in reality she was real, and to me she is, you make her very real, she died without knowing it. She should have read your book. How many, even an artist isn't world-renowned until they die. Why is it that we don't value people while they're here?
I think ultimately, yes, well, that's an excellent question, and not just in the arts. It's for all of us and every day, right? Why do we not value a thing or a person until it's gone? I think ultimately most artists need to focus on doing the work that is in them to do and not worrying so much about who's up and who's down.
But it would help.
It would help.
If they got a few $1,000s
Yeah.
for the first painting as for the 150th.
Yeah.
Does it stay with you? Do these people seem real to you in your head?
Yes. I mean, I just, fiction writers don't have confusion. I think some people who are not fiction writers sometimes wonder if we get confused. There's no confusion between what's fictional and what's real. I mean, that's a very clear line. But having said that, I spend a lot of time imagining and sort of trying to embody these people. It's not just what do they say, it's what did it feel like to walk down the street? What did they smell? What did they see? What do the cobblestones feel like through those thin soles of the shoes?
You depicted that very well.
And so once you do that, they become a part of you. And I miss writing about the characters now that they're gone. And just as I could tell you how, if you named 10 real people in my life and you said, here's a funny situation, what would they say in response to it? I might be able to say, oh, this person would say this, that person would say that. I could do the same for my characters.
Well, I want to know if they had their baby in the end and was it a boy or a girl. Because that disappointed me. that would be the happy ending that I kept on looking at that last page and it's blank. You don't think you'll ever write a sequel?
I don't think I will with these characters. I think, it's always an interesting question to me. Where does a story end? When do you decide you've you can end a story because real life goes on and on. And I always feel like the moment when a story ends has to be when we've learned enough from watching these characters either change in response to the events of the story or fail to change. Sometimes people fail to change. And because we've seen them change or fail to change throughout, we can guess how the rest of their life will be different because of this. We know enough now to pretty much be able to guess what they'll do next. And that's, to me, when the story ends. So I feel like at the end, I have a sense of where I think, what choices I think Aaron will make. And, you know.
But you didn't share them with me. Are you working on something else?
I've got kind of 40 pages of something, but I think I'm an odd writer in that I don't outline, and so this whole long book was
500 and some odd pages.
Right, and this may sound crazy, but it's true. It was an act of improvisation. I might have some ideas about where I thought it was going to go, but I can't outline in advance because to me, I would feel then like I was working my characters like a puppeteer. I have
to fit the outline.
Yeah, because to me, what plot is like the outcome of an equation, and you have characters, you have people, plus pressure. People are under pressure. And then they do things in response to that pressure, and that's the plot. But if you put the two of us under an identical pressure, I'm sure we'd respond to it differently. If you put 100 people under the same pressure, you'll have 100 different responses, so 100 different plots. So I have to figure out, well, who are my characters and what pressures are they under? Okay, here's Esther. She lives in the 17th century. She's forbidden all these forms of writing and intellectual development, but she has these questions burning in her to ask, questions that are dangerous. People are being killed for asking these questions in her era. And then you have Helen 350 years later, and she's near the end of her academic career, and she's very isolated, and she's in poor health. And she has a hand tremor. She shouldn't be handling delicate documents, and she's called in because these documents have been found, and she can't touch them. She can't literally touch these things. So she's got to rely on Aaron, this American grad student, who she can't stand, and he's arrogant, right? So these are all pressures. And then I look at them and I think, well, what would these characters do in response to these pressures? And then the plot just goes from there. So that's a very long way of saying, I've started something else. I have no idea where it's going.
Do you give yourself a timeline on start and finish? Do you have a publisher that says May 12th?
I give myself many timelines.
Don't we all?
I think it's a Douglas Adams quote. I love deadlines. I love the whooshing sound they make as they fly past.
Go by.
No, I because I don't know where the work is going to go, I can start something and think it's going to be 5 pages and then it's 20. So, but I do try to set things, and then as things get a little more developed, that's when I can then show them to my agent and my editor, and then I have real deadlines and you know.
Did you study to be a writer?
I did. Yes, I majored in English with a minor in creative writing as an undergrad, and then I did a master's in English with a concentration in creative writing. And now I teach MFA students in creative writing at the Leslie program, MFA program in creative writing.
Do you find your education was beneficial and helpful, or did they crowd you?
I found it was really helpful. I think there are a lot of different routes to being a writer. And, you know, getting the degrees is certainly not the only one. The way I was able to do it, I worked with really remarkable people. I had tremendous good luck. And then I also was able to really just use that time to make space for the writing. And
so you were writing while you were in school? Well, you almost have to. Once
Yes.
you get into that environment, sometimes you get locked into it and you forget to live your life.
Yeah.
So the fact that you're somebody's mom, somebody's wife, you didn't have the opportunity. So plus, you're almost as good as Esther. She
well,
lived
thank
a
you. That's a
double
high
life.
bar.
But everybody can't do that. Everybody
It's
can't
tough.
go outside of their own, what the world expects of them.
My mother was a very pioneering person she became a doc and medical researcher when not a lot of women were doing that, and I grew up watching that and seeing that it's not easy. My dad was really supportive, so I had good role models.
Yeah, thank you, God. My mom was 5'3", and I often think if she had been born now, the world would have been her oyster. But she was born in the 30s, and there were constraints on you then. Even she was divorced in the 50s. I was the only single parent home in my school. Now, I'm the only 57 years married parent in my kids' classrooms. There's been a whole, so yeah, I had a strong role model, and I think that's very important for boys and girls.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
What do you want for your kids? Do you want them to be writers? Jacob.
This is going to sound like a cliche. I want them to be happy. I want them to do what gives them joy,
Cool.
makes them feel satisfied, and makes for a well-balanced life for them. So whatever it is, I got
Good
their
luck
backs.
with that, everything up to well-balanced. Have you found that yet?
I'm working on it.
Never give up. Your parents, what did they think of your writing?
They've been really wonderfully supportive, and I imagine it's scary having a writer in the family. I imagine.
Is that
know what they're
character
gonna
after
say
me?
next.
Was
but
that your Aunt May?
They've been great, and in fact, I have a wonderful great aunt Lily, and when my first book came out, some friends of hers called her up and said, so where are you in your great niece's books? And she said, if you want to find me, come to my house. That's where I am.
Cool.
And it's,
I'll read the book and make up your own mind.
Yeah.
Anybody challenge you on any of your historical perfectness, which I think you did really well?
Well, thank you. But, I did an enormous amount of research. I knew there were going to be some errors, and there were some small things. I had a reader write into me and tell me that at the start of, I know it's chapter 6, and at the start of all the 17th century chapters, I have the Christian Gregorian calendar date, and I have the Hebrew calendar date. And so I list, the day, the month, and the year, the day, the month, and the year. And then in this scene, there's a line describing the sharp disk of the moon. And someone wrote it into me and said, on that date in the Hebrew calendar, there's no full moon in, the year 1650 something. And they're absolutely right, because the Hebrew calendar is lunar calendar. So I corrected that. In the paperback, it's corrected now. That's an observant reader. There were a few things like that, but I was really careful before putting the book out. I had expert readers in a few fields read it, and I was careful with the research for two reasons. One is that I didn't want that kind of thing where you read a book that happens to be about something you know about, or a place you've lived, or a profession you've worked in, and they make an error, and suddenly it blows the whole illusion. That would never happen, and But also,
and they've also never written a book.
Yes, but also I thought, when I finished the book, people were going to say to me, well, Ester Velasquez, your 17th century character, manages to find a way to live a life of the mind. Pretty fiction, but we know that didn't happen because we know the names of all 6 or 7 women in 17th century London who wrote philosophy, and she wasn't one of them. And I wanted to be able to say, yeah, of course she's fictitious, but given the realities of women's lives and restrictions and all of that, the only way to write or to have a painting out there or a symphony or something like that was going to be, if a woman was not an aristocrat, wealthy Christian, was going to be to do it under a man's name. So how do we know that someone didn't do something like this? And so I wanted to be really careful with the history, because I wanted to make clear I'm not taking any shortcuts with the history. I really think that given all the facts we know about history, down to the cost of a loaf of bread in 1665, which you can find out, I was careful about all of it because I think it's very plausible that a woman could have done something like this amid the real history of the time.
I wouldn't be surprised if there was a woman today that was writing under a masculine name.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Just to make it happen. I particularly appreciate that you educated me. I had the opportunity to live with Jewish families in the 60s, and I learned a lot, and I was grateful because in my community, we didn't know, and I wouldn't for the life of me offend, but there were certain things that I didn't understand, and you didn't hit me over the head with a baseball bat or a big club. But you explained to me little nuances of the Jewish faith and the Jewish tradition that made me go, oh, okay. Now I can remember wondering about that, and I can remember questioning that. So thank you very much for educating me on the little things that I hadn't picked up on over the centuries.
Well, but I was educating myself too. I mean, I had a lot of Jewish education growing up, but I didn't know anything about this history. I didn't know the 17th century history. I didn't know the Sephardic history. When I started, I was drawn to this community in 17th century Amsterdam and then London, because I was researching. I was looking for the right time period for the story. But then what got me is I started reading about these characters and reading some of their documents, and you could hear how frightened they were. They were afraid, you know, when they excommunicated Spinoza, they were afraid that somebody was going to come along and upset the balance, because they were Inquisition refugees. They were refugees from the Portuguese and Spanish Inquisitions. They'd found these little perches of safety, but they knew that anything could mess it up for them at any time. And when I read this, I thought, well, it's different centuries, but I know these people because I grew up around refugees. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors. My mother was born on the run. And I thought there was something so familiar about their really beautiful desire to rebuild their communities, and that brittleness, that fear. If one little thing goes wrong, it could all happen again. That was familiar. And so I said, okay, I'm going to write about these people, but then I had to learn everything. I had to learn all the 17th century history, the Sephardic Jewish history. So that, to me, it was a pleasure to educate myself as I wrote.
Well, would you like to educate our audience and read them a piece of your book so they don't just have to believe me?
I
We'll
would be
be right
delighted
back.
to. June 8th, 1691, 11th Sivan of the Hebrew year 5451, Richmond, Surrey. Let me begin afresh, perhaps this time to tell the truth. For in the biting hush of ink on paper, where truth ought raise its head and speak without fear, I have long lied. I have not to defend my actions, yet though my heart feels no remorse, my deeds would confess themselves to paper now as the least of tributes to him whom I once betrayed. In this silenced house, quill and ink do not resist the press of my hand, and paper does not flinch. Let these pages compass, at last, the truth, though none read them. Those paragraphs are the opening of the book. That's the first time we hear the voice of Ester Velasquez, who is the main character in the 17th century, the woman who leaves behind the papers. And I'm going to read just the one page in the 21st century. So several centuries later, these papers are discovered, and they're discovered by Helen Watt, who is a professor. She's not Jewish, but she's a professor of Jewish studies. She's British. And this is in London, and a former student of hers has called her to say that he and his wife have discovered the papers in a 17th century house owned by the wife, inherited through the wife's family. They're turning it into an art gallery, and they've had an electrician come in to put in some wiring, and he opened the old carved staircase to put the wiring up and discovered shelves full of old papers. So they call Helen because they recognize one of the papers is signed with the name of a rabbi, and they ask her to come. She goes out there convinced that the papers probably aren't 17th century and won't have value. Helen also has a hand tremor, and so should not be touching delicate documents. There, on a small card table beside the window, was a single cracked leather-bound volume. Beside it lay the 2 pages Ian had told her about over the phone, the first items his electrician had removed from under the staircase upon discovering the documents. For an instant, Helen allowed herself to stare at the pages, taking in the thick, textured paper she dared not touch. Then, at the counterpoint of 2 alphabets on the page, the Portuguese lettering that led from left to right, interrupted by scattered Hebrew phrases that ran in the reverse direction. Slowly she read and reread. Ian's voice coming from just behind her. "Over there," he said, and pointed. She lifted her eyes. There, in a dim corner at the base of the staircase, untouched by the blinding light of the landing's windows, was a small panel that had been forced open. Ignoring Ian's tentative offer of help, Helen approached the opening. Lowering herself slowly to the floor, her cane trembling heavily under her weight, she knelt before it like a penitent. She stayed that way for a long time, her hands pressed to the cool floor, and a great heaviness nearly overcame her, as though all her years had suddenly taken on physical weight. For a long time she simply stared at the crammed shelves, breathing very quietly. Then finally, Knowing she should not, she lifted a quaking hand to remove a single page. A moment only. The page, astonishingly, rested unharmed on her two outspread palms, like a bird that had agreed for just this moment to alight there.
Excellent. Appetizer for a full meal. Curl up in a chair and really enjoy it. And the value of those paragraphs is part of my education. I often get books in which the word God is not completely written out. I didn't understand that. Nobody explained it to me. The value of finding these papers is because, is it an Orthodox Jewish person? If you write the name of God, you have to destroy the paper. You can't throw it away because it would be disrespectful to the Lord. So they have to be burned.
Or buried.
Or buried, okay. Now these, as you eventually will find out, were taken in haste as they were fleeing this house in the 16th, 17th century and tucked into this cabinet, and nobody ever knew they were there. So to find them unburned, unburied, and with signatures of these rabbis is what makes the whole picture come together. You did one hell of a job.
Thank you.
Will you come back with the next one when it comes together?
I would be delighted to.
Well, thank you for
Thank
being
you so
with
much.
us. My guest has been Rachel Kadish, and the book is available wherever you want to look for it. That's it for Off the Shelf Books on Tour. Have a good one. I'll get used to it after a while. Bye.